My son banned me from his wedding, but sent me a bill for $100,000 to pay for it. His note read, "Thank me for letting you contribute since you won't be there anyway." I stared at that invoice in disbelief. 27 years of sacrifice, and this was my reward? The boy I raised alone wanted my money but not my presence on the biggest day of his life. I smiled coldly. His perfect wedding was about to become a very expensive lesson. Subscribe and tell us where you're listening from in the comments. The envelope had arrived on a Tuesday morning, thick cream paper with Brandon's name embossed in gold lettering. For a moment my heart lifted. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe there was still time to fix whatever had gone wrong between us. But as I opened it, my hope crumbled like an old newspaper. The wedding invitation was beautiful. Expensive cardstock, elegant script, every detail screaming money. Madison's influence, no doubt. But my name wasn't on the guest list. Instead, tucked behind the invitation like some cruel joke, was an itemized bill. Venue rental, $20,000. Catering, $35,000. Photography, $12,000. Hawaiian honeymoon, $18,000. Flowers, music, transportation, designer wedding dress. The numbers blurred together until they reached that final sum at the bottom, written in Brandon's unmistakable handwriting, $100,000. I sat in my empty kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd packed his school lunches for 5 years after Sarah died, where I'd helped him with homework until my eyes burned from exhaustion. The coffee in my mug had gone cold, but I couldn't move. 27 years of being both mother and father to that boy. And this was how he repaid me. I unfolded his handwritten note and read it again, each word like a knife twist. "Thank me for letting you contribute, since you won't be there anyway." The arrogance of it took my breath away. Thank him. As if demanding $100,000 from the father you've banned from your wedding was some kind of generous favor. As if I should be grateful for the privilege of financing my own exclusion while being told I wasn't worthy of witnessing the moment I'd spent 27 years preparing for him. The casual cruelty hit me harder than any physical blow could have. This wasn't just asking for money. This was calculated humiliation, designed to remind me of my place in his new world. I was good enough to pay the bills, but not good enough to sit in the pews, valuable as a bank account, worthless as a father. I thought about the nights I'd worked double shifts at the electrical plant, coming home to find 7-year-old Brandon asleep at the kitchen table, still waiting for me. I thought about selling my father's vintage motorcycle to pay for his college tuition, telling myself it was worth it to give him opportunities I'd never had. I thought about the graduation ceremony where he'd barely acknowledged me, too busy taking photos with Madison's wealthy parents to notice his old man standing alone in his cheap suit. The phone rang, startling me from my memories. Brandon's name flashed on the screen. My finger hovered over the answer button for a moment before I let it go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to hear his voice yet, and wasn't ready to pretend this was normal. But as I stared at that bill, at Brandon's handwritten note with its casual demand that I thank him for letting me contribute, something shifted inside me. The hurt was still there, sharp and fresh as an open wound, but underneath it, something colder was taking shape. Brandon thought he could use me like an ATM while cutting me out of his life. He thought his old man would just roll over and pay up like always, grateful for the privilege of being financially useful while personally discarded. He was about to learn how wrong he was. I walked to the old oak desk in my living room, the one I'd inherited from my father, and pulled out a worn address book. The pages were yellow with age, filled with phone numbers I hadn't called in years. But I remembered every name, every favor I was owed, every connection I'd built during 27 years in construction and electrical work. Brandon might think his college education made him smarter than his blue-collar father, but he'd forgotten something important. I'd been fighting battles since before he was born. The voicemail notification blinked on my phone like an accusation. I played it back, already knowing what I'd hear. "Dad, it's me. Look, I know the amount seems high, but this is important to Madison and her family. They have certain expectations, you know. And it's not like you need the money for anything else. You're retired, living in that same old house. This is your chance to do something meaningful for my future. Call me back when you're ready to discuss the details. Not a single word of regret. No acknowledgement of what he was asking, just that casual assumption that my life, my savings, my feelings didn't matter compared to Madison's expectations. I closed my eyes and let myself remember the woman I'd loved and lost. Sarah had died when Brandon was 7, a heart attack that came without warning on a spring morning that started like any other. I'd found him that night, curled up in his closet with her favorite sweater pressed against his face, asking when she was coming home. "It's just us now, buddy," I whispered, holding him while he sobbed. "But we're going to be okay. I promise you that." Keeping that promise had cost me everything. I'd turned down a promotion that would have required relocating, knowing Brandon needed stability. I'd worked nights and weekends, saving every penny for his future. When Linda Morrison asked me to dinner 2 years after Sarah's death, I'd said no, telling myself Brandon wasn't ready for me to date. The truth was, I wasn't ready to split my attention between my grief and my son's needs. The years blurred together, little league games where I was the only parent cheering from the bleachers, school conferences where teachers praised Brandon's intelligence while I worked double shifts to pay for his tutoring. I'd scraped together enough money to send him to Stanford, watching my bank account drain like water through a sieve, telling myself it was worth it when he called home excited about his classes. The calls became less frequent during his sophomore year. By junior year, they'd stopped altogether unless he needed money. When he brought Madison home for Christmas that final year, I'd known immediately that something had changed. The way she looked around our modest house with barely concealed distaste. The way Brandon seemed embarrassed by my work clothes, my simple way of speaking. "Dad, this is Madison Harris," he'd said that night, and I'd caught the slight emphasis on her last name, as if it should mean something to me. "Pleasure to meet you, Madison," I'd replied, offering my hand. She'd shaken it briefly, then immediately reached for the hand sanitizer in her purse. Over dinner, she'd talked about her father's law practice, her mother's charity work, their house in the hills. Every story was designed to highlight the gap between their world and mine. Brandon hung on her every word, nodding along as she described their yearly trips to Europe. "What do you do for fun around here?" she'd asked, looking around our small living room. "Well," I'd said, "Brandon and I used to fish at Miller's Lake every Saturday morning, started when he was 8 years old." "Oh, we don't really do that anymore, Dad," Brandon had said quickly, shooting me a warning look. "Madison's more into different activities." That night I'd sat in the garage looking at our old fishing gear collecting dust on the shelves. 20 years of Saturday mornings, teaching him to tie flies and read the water, sharing quiet conversations between fathers and sons. All of it dismissed with a casual, "We don't really do that anymore." The pattern continued after graduation. Brandon got his marketing job, moved in with Madison, started living a life that had no room for his father except when he needed financial help. Car payment when he was between jobs. Security deposit for their apartment. Money for Madison's birthday gift because she's used to nice things, Dad. Each request came with the same subtle implication that I should be grateful to help, that this was my purpose in his life now. The old man who existed to write checks and stay out of sight. But this bill, this $100,000 invoice for my own exclusion, was different. This wasn't asking for help. This was demanding payment for the privilege of being discarded. I opened my laptop and logged into my bank account, $97,432. He was asking for more than everything I had, expecting me to somehow find additional funds or take out loans against my house to cover the difference. My phone buzzed with a text message from Brandon. "Dad, I need an answer by Friday. The deposits are due and Madison's family is expecting confirmation. I already told the venue you'd guaranteed the full amount. Don't let me down. Don't let him down." As if I hadn't spent 3 decades putting his needs before my own. As if every sacrifice I'd made had been erased by his new life, his new priorities, his new family who saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience with a checkbook. I walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the small garden Sarah had planted before she died. I'd kept it going all these years, tending her roses because it was the one thing that still connected me to the woman I'd loved. Brandon used to help me weed those flower beds when he was young. He'd complain about the dirt under his fingernails, but he'd stay out there with me until the job was done. When had I lost that boy? When had he become this stranger who could send me a bill for my own heartbreak? The answer hit me like a cold wind. I hadn't lost him. He'd been taken from me, slowly and deliberately, by people who saw my love for my son as weakness to be exploited. But they were about to learn something about Austin Russell that they'd apparently forgotten. I hadn't survived 27 years in construction by being weak. I'd built my life from nothing, raised my son alone, and carved out a decent existence through sheer determination. And I wasn't about to let anyone, not even my own son, walk all over me without consequences. I called Stephen Jenkins at 7 the next morning, knowing he'd be up before dawn like all the old construction crew. 30 years we'd worked together, and Stephen had always been the smartest guy on any job site. Now he owned his own contracting company and had the kind of connections that came with success. "Austin Russell," his voice boomed through the phone. "Heard you were living a retired life. What brings you back to the land of the living?" "Need some advice, Steve, and maybe a favor. You saved my ass when that scaffold collapsed in '98. Far as I'm concerned, you've got unlimited favors coming. What do you need?" I explained the situation carefully, leaving out the emotional details but making sure Stephen understood the scope of what Brandon was asking. When I finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Jesus, Austin, 100 grand for a wedding? What's he marrying, the Queen of England?" "Close enough. Her family's got money, and they've convinced him he needs to keep up appearances." "And he banned you from the ceremony?" "That's right." Stephen's voice hardened. "That's not just disrespectful, Austin. That's cruel. What kind of man does that to his father?" "The kind who thinks money grows on trees and old men exist to shake them." "What do you want to know?" "Everything you can find out about Brandon Russell and Madison Harris. Financial situation, employment history, who they owe money to. I want a complete picture before I make my next move. Consider it done. I've got a guy who handles background checks for our bigger projects. Completely legitimate, all public records. Give me 48 hours. After hanging up with Stephen, I drove across town to visit my bank. Carol Manning had been my account manager for 15 years, and she knew my financial situation better than anyone. "Austin," she greeted me with a smile, then noticed my expression. "Everything okay?" "I need to put some protections in place, Carol, starting with removing Brandon Russell as a beneficiary on my accounts." Her smile faded. "That's a significant change. Are you sure you want to?" "I'm sure, and I want to set up some new security protocols. If anyone calls claiming to be me or my family, they need to provide verification beyond just knowing my account numbers." "Has something happened?" I showed her Brandon's bill, watching her eyes widen as she read the itemized list. By the time she finished, her professional composure had cracked. "Austin, I've never seen anything like this. He's asking for more than everything you have." "And he's not asking, he's demanding." Carol shook her head slowly. "I'll make the changes immediately. And Austin, if you need any documentation about your account history or transactions, you let me know. What your son is trying to do, it's not right." That afternoon, Stephen called back with the first round of information. Brandon's $45,000 in credit card debt spread across 6 different cards. Madison's been living beyond their means for 2 years, and Brandon's been covering the difference. His employment history shows 3 job changes in the last 18 months, each one after he couldn't meet sales quotas. "What about Madison?" "Interesting girl. Daddy's a lawyer, but not the successful kind she pretends. He's got a small practice handling minor civil cases. The family money she talks about? There isn't any. They're mortgaged to the hilt on a house they can't afford, trying to maintain appearances in a social circle that's way above their real income level." The picture was becoming clearer. Brandon hadn't just fallen in love with a woman. He'd fallen in love with the idea of a life he couldn't afford, and Madison was happy to encourage his delusions as long as someone else was paying the bills. "There's more," Stephen continued. "I had my guy check deeper into their recent activities. Guess what venue they booked for this $100,000 wedding? Surprise me. Grandview Manor, same place where Madison's boss got married last year. The deposit alone was $40,000, and according to the contract, they used your name as the financial guarantor without your knowledge or consent." My hand tightened on the phone. They what? Your son put you down as the responsible party for the entire bill. Far as the venue knows, Austin Russell guaranteed payment for the whole wedding. They've already started ordering flowers, booking vendors, arranging the whole production based on your supposed agreement to pay. The betrayal went deeper than I'd imagined. Brandon hadn't just asked me to pay for his wedding. He'd already committed me to the debt without my knowledge, gambling on my love for him to cover his fraud. That evening, Brandon called again. This time I answered. Dad, thank God, I was starting to worry you were going to make this difficult. Difficult? I kept my voice neutral. What's difficult about your request, son? Look, I know it's a lot of money, but Madison's family has certain expectations. Her friends are all having these elaborate weddings, and if we don't match that standard, it reflects badly on both families. I already promised them you'd cover it. You promised them what? There was a pause. I told them you were happy to contribute, that you understood how important this was to me. Brandon, help me understand something. How exactly did Grandview Manor get the impression that I was guaranteeing payment for your venue without me ever signing anything? Another pause, longer this time. Madison handled most of the venue negotiations. She said she'd take care of the paperwork details. So you don't know how my name ended up on their contract as financial guarantor? Dad, does it matter? You're going to pay for it anyway, right? This is just paperwork. The casual way he dismissed my concerns, the assumption that I'd just roll over and accept being defrauded, his breezy repetition of that phrase that had haunted me since Tuesday, thank me for letting you contribute, finally broke something inside me. But instead of anger, I felt a strange calm settle over my thoughts. You know what, son? You're absolutely right. This is just paperwork, and I'm very good at reading the fine print. So you'll take care of the deposits. Oh, I'll take care of everything. Don't worry about that. Great. Madison will be so relieved. She's been stressed about the timeline and... Brandon, I interrupted, I want you to know that I love you. I've loved you since the day you were born, and that will never change. Dad, you're being weird. Of course you love me. That's why you're doing this. No, son. That's exactly why I'm not. I hung up before he could respond. The war was about to begin, and it was time to choose my weapons carefully. Brandon thought he was playing chess with a man who'd never learned the rules. He was about to discover that his old man had been playing the game longer than he'd been alive, and I'd learned to win by rules he didn't even know existed. Stephen's second report arrived Thursday morning via email, and it was even more damaging than I'd expected. Along with the financial information, he'd uncovered something that made my blood run cold. Austin, you need to see this. His voice was grim when I called him back. My guy found some interesting communications between Madison and someone named Patrick Ross. Seems your future daughter-in-law has been planning more than just a wedding. What kind of communications? Text messages, emails, financial transactions? She's been in a relationship with Patrick Ross for 8 months. He's one of the groomsmen, by the way. Rich family, trust fund kid. The interesting part is, she's pregnant, and the timeline doesn't match up with when she started dating your son. The room seemed to tilt around me. She's pregnant? It gets worse. There's a recording my guy managed to obtain through some electronic surveillance, completely legal, picked up from a public restaurant. Madison and Patrick discussing their plan. Quote, "Don't worry, after I marry Brandon and we can file for divorce, we'll have enough from the settlement to start over, plus child support for 18 years. He'll never know the baby isn't his." I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair, staring out at Sarah's garden. Not only was Brandon being used financially, he was being set up for a lifetime of deception. This woman was planning to trap him in a marriage built on lies, then destroy him financially while passing off another man's child as his own. There's more financial evidence, too. Patrick Ross has been transferring money to Madison for months, $50,000 over the past 6 months, all disguised as loans that were never meant to be repaid. They've already put a deposit on a luxury apartment together, dated 3 months ago. My phone buzzed with an incoming call from Brandon. I ignored it. "Steve, I need 2 things from you. First, copies of everything your guy found. Full documentation. Second, I need you to contact Grandview Manor and every vendor on that list. Tell them that Austin Russell is disputing any financial responsibility for the Russell-Harris wedding and that all future payments need to be confirmed directly with me before any services are rendered. Consider it done. But Austin, what are you planning? I'm planning to save my son from the biggest mistake of his life, and I'm going to do it in a way that teaches him exactly what his choices have cost both of us. Friday morning, I drove to Grandview Manor. The wedding planner, Diana Coleman, met me in the lobby with a stack of contracts and a worried expression. "Mr. Russell, thank you for coming in. When your friend called yesterday, it raised some concerns about our payment arrangements. Show me exactly what my son submitted." She spread the contracts across a conference table. There it was, Austin Russell listed as the financial guarantor for all wedding expenses, with what appeared to be my signature at the bottom of the page, though I'd never signed it. "Miss Coleman, I need you to understand something very clearly. I never signed this document, I never agreed to guarantee payment for this wedding, and I will not be responsible for any charges related to this event. That signature was forged." Her face went pale. "But Mr. Russell, we've already invested significant resources. The deposits, the vendor bookings, the menu planning. Then I suggest you contact the actual people getting married and ask them how they plan to pay their bills. As of right now, you have no valid financial guarantee from me. But the wedding is tomorrow. That's unfortunate timing for everyone involved." I left Grandview Manor and spent the rest of the day making similar visits to the florist, the photographer, the caterer, and the band. By evening, Brandon's dream wedding was collapsing like a house of cards. My phone had been ringing constantly. Brandon, Madison, even Madison's parents. I ignored them all until Stephen called. "Austin, you might want to brace yourself. My guy just intercepted some communications that suggest Madison and Patrick are planning to accelerate their timeline. Apparently, they're worried someone might have discovered their scheme." "What kind of acceleration?" "They're talking about eloping, taking the money they've already gotten from Brandon and disappearing together. Madison was planning to leave him at the altar anyway, but now they're thinking about doing it before the ceremony." The irony was perfect. In trying to save money on a wedding that was never going to happen, I was actually saving Brandon from an even worse betrayal. Saturday morning arrived gray and overcast. I parked down the street from Grandview Manor, close enough to see the entrance but far enough away to avoid being spotted immediately. The first guests began arriving around 11. Expensive cars pulling into the parking lot, people in designer dresses and tailored suits looking confused as they approached the venue. Through my car window, I could see Diana Coleman standing at the entrance, clearly having difficult conversations with arriving guests. My phone started ringing constantly. Brandon, Madison, even some numbers I didn't recognize. I ignored them all until Stephen called. "Austin, you need to know what's happening. The venue is a disaster. Half the vendors are demanding cash payments before they'll set up. The other half have already left. Brandon and Madison are inside screaming at each other while their guests mill around in confusion." 20 minutes later, I watched through my windshield as Madison came running out of the building in her wedding dress, heading for Patrick's BMW with a suitcase in hand. Patrick was close behind her, not even bothering to look back at the chaos they were leaving behind. Brandon appeared in the doorway, watching his bride-to-be drive away with another man. Even from down the street, I could see the devastation on his face as guests began streaming out of the venue, some taking photos with their phones, others shaking their heads in disbelief. My phone rang again. This time, when I saw Brandon's name, I answered. "She's gone, Dad. Madison's gone. She left with Patrick, and she admitted everything. The baby, the money, all of it. She said I was stupid to never see what was in front of me." His voice was breaking, the sound of a man whose entire world had collapsed. "I know, son." "You knew? How long have you known?" "Long enough to save you from making the biggest mistake of your life. But everyone saw it happen. Everyone knows I got left at the altar. My career, my reputation, everything is ruined." For the first time in this whole ordeal, I felt genuine sympathy for Brandon. Madison had played her role perfectly, making sure his humiliation was as public and devastating as possible. "Brandon, where are you right now?" I'm still at the venue. I don't know what to do. The guests are all leaving, and I don't have money to pay for any of this mess. Stay there. I'm coming to get you. Dad, I'm so sorry. About everything. The bill, the way I treated you, all of it. You were right about her, and I was too blind to see it. We'll talk about it later. Right now, you need help, and despite everything, you're still my son. As I started my car and pulled toward the venue, I reflected on what I'd accomplished. I'd saved Brandon from a fraudulent marriage, exposed Madison's scheme, and taught my son a lesson about respect and consequences that he'd never forget. But as I watched him standing alone in the parking lot, surrounded by the wreckage of his dreams, I realized something else. Revenge wasn't nearly as satisfying as I'd thought it would be, not when the person you were punishing was someone you loved. I found Brandon sitting on the steps of Grandview Manor, still in his tuxedo, head in his hands. The parking lot was nearly empty now except for a few stragglers taking photos with their phones, the kind of people who couldn't resist documenting someone else's misery for social media. "Come on," I said, walking up to him. "Let's go home." He looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I don't have a home anymore. Madison and I were supposed to move into a new apartment next week. I already gave notice on my old place. Then it's a good thing I kept your room exactly the way you left it." The drive back to my house was mostly silent. Brandon stared out the window like he was seeing the familiar streets for the first time. When we pulled into my driveway, he noticed the garden. "Mom's roses are blooming," he said quietly. "They bloom every year. You'd know that if you ever visited." He flinched but didn't argue. We went inside, and I made coffee while he sat at the kitchen table, still looking shell-shocked. "Tell me what really happened today," I said, setting a mug in front of him. Brandon wrapped his hands around the cup. Everything fell apart at once. The vendors started demanding payment. Madison started freaking out. That's when Patrick shows up and pulls Madison aside for this intense conversation. He took a shaky sip of coffee. When I confronted them, Madison just looked at me and said, "The plan where we stop pretending." Patrick told me the baby was his, matter of fact, like he was commenting on the weather. Said they'd been together for almost a year. "When did you figure out I knew?" Brandon looked up with something like wonder. "When you mentioned Patrick Ross in the apartment. There was no way you could have known those details unless— How long have you been investigating them?" "Since Tuesday, the day after you sent me that bill." "Why didn't you just tell me what you found out? Why let it happen this way?" I sat down across from him. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. You would have thought I was just a jealous old man trying to ruin your happiness. Madison would have convinced you I was lying. So instead you let me be humiliated in front of everyone. I let you learn the truth in a way that couldn't be denied. Sometimes that's the only way people can hear it." Brandon was quiet for a long moment. "Were you ever going to pay the $100,000? "No. Because I knew the wedding was a fraud, and I knew Madison was using you. Paying for it would have been enabling your destruction. But you let me believe you might. You let me think you were considering it. I let you reveal who you really were. Every conversation we had after that bill arrived showed me exactly how you saw our relationship. As a transaction, not as a bond between father and son." Brandon flinched. "I didn't mean it that way." "Didn't you? When you sent me that bill, when you wrote thank me for letting you contribute, what were you thinking? Did you consider, even for a moment, how those words would make me feel?" "I was desperate. Madison kept talking about her family's expectations, about how embarrassing it would be if we couldn't afford the wedding she wanted. She made it sound like you'd be happy to help, like it was what family does." "Family," I repeated slowly. "When was the last time you called me just to see how I was doing? When was the last time you visited without needing something?" The silence stretched between us. Brandon stared into his coffee cup, unable to meet my eyes. "I kept track, you know," I continued. "After your mother died, I marked every important moment in your life on the calendar. First day of school, science fairs, graduation ceremonies, job interviews. I was always there, always ready to celebrate your victories or comfort you through your defeats. But somewhere along the way, I became invisible to you except when you needed money. Dad, Let me finish. The hardest part wasn't the money you asked for over the years. It was watching you become someone your mother wouldn't recognize. Sarah raised you to be kind, to be grateful, to understand that love isn't something you can buy or sell. She would have been devastated to see you treat people like obstacles to overcome rather than human beings worthy of respect. Brandon's shoulders shook. I loved Mom too. I miss her every day. Then why didn't you honor her memory? Why didn't you live up to the values she taught you? Because it was easier not to. Because Madison made me feel like those values were naive, like kindness was weakness and gratitude was something only unsuccessful people needed to worry about. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Your mother had a phrase she used when you were small and made mistakes. She'd say, Brandon, you can choose to be better than your worst moment. Today was one of your worst moments, son. The question is, what are you going to choose now? I want to choose better. I want to be the son she raised, the son you deserved. But I don't know if I remember how. Then we'll figure it out together. But it starts with understanding that rebuilding trust takes time. It starts with actions, not words. What kind of actions? Real ones, hard ones, the kind that requires sacrifice and humility. Are you ready for that? Brandon looked up at me with red-rimmed eyes that reminded me of the 7-year-old boy who'd cried in my arms the night his mother died. I'm ready, Dad. I want to earn your respect again. I want to earn the right to call myself your son. For the first time since I'd opened that wedding invitation, I felt a spark of hope. That evening, we ordered pizza and sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint Sarah's garden in shades of gold and amber. It felt like the first honest conversation we'd had in years. Dad, can I ask you something? Sure. When Mom died, how did you keep going? How did you stay strong when everything fell apart? I thought about that terrible time, the months of grief and fear and overwhelming responsibility. I focused on what mattered most, taking care of you, building a life that would make your mother proud, doing the right thing even when it was hard. I lost sight of that, didn't I? For a while, but people can change, Brandon. They can remember who they're supposed to be. As the stars came out, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not for the relationship we'd lost, but for the one we might build. It would be different than before, founded on honesty instead of obligation, respect instead of assumption. It would be built on the understanding that love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's just enablement wearing a prettier mask. And for the first time since I'd opened that wedding invitation, I believed that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. 6 months later, I found Brandon in the backyard teaching Tommy how to use a level. My sister's 12-year-old son had been staying with us for the summer while she dealt with her divorce, and watching the two of them work together reminded me of all those Saturday mornings I'd spent teaching Brandon the same skills. Brandon had found steady work with Stephen's construction company and was slowly paying down his debts. Every month he contributed to room and board, half of which I secretly saved for him. The transformation hadn't been easy. Those first weeks after the wedding disaster were brutal for both of us. Brandon had to swallow his pride and take a job that paid a fraction of what he'd earned in marketing. There were nights I'd hear him on the phone with former colleagues who'd heard about the wedding debacle, his voice tight with embarrassment as he explained why he couldn't meet them for expensive dinners anymore. But gradually, something shifted. I watched him discover satisfaction in work that produced tangible results, walls that stood straight, electrical systems that functioned perfectly, projects completed on time and within budget. His hands, once soft from office work, developed calluses that he wore with growing pride rather than shame. You know what's strange, Dad? He'd said one evening after a particularly challenging day installing kitchen cabinets. I used to think success meant having other people do the hard work while I sat in meetings talking about strategy. But there's something powerful about building something with your own hands, about knowing that what you created will still be standing long after you're gone. The community had taken notice too. Word traveled fast in construction circles about Austin Russell's son, the college boy who'd swallowed his pride and started over from the bottom. Some of the older workers, men who'd known me for decades, began including Brandon in their after-work conversations, sharing stories about projects and teaching him tricks they'd learned over years of experience. "Stephen offered me a supervisor position," he told me that evening as we sat on the porch. "You've earned it. It comes with enough money that I could get my own place." He paused. "But I'd rather stay here. I like our Saturday fishing trips, working in Mom's garden together." "You're welcome to stay as long as you want, son." He looked at me directly. "Madison called yesterday asking for money. Patrick left her when the baby was born." "What did you tell her?" "That I'd learned the difference between helping people and enabling them. A year ago I might have felt guilty enough to send money, not anymore." The growth in his voice was unmistakable, not the bitter hardness of someone who'd been hurt, but the quiet strength of someone who'd learned to set boundaries without losing compassion. "There's something else," he continued. "I want to be involved with the scholarship fund, mentor some of the kids, help them avoid my mistakes." That became our evening ritual, reading scholarship applications together. Kids like Emma Martinez, working 2 jobs while caring for her younger brother, or Marcus Wilson, helping his mom run their family restaurant while maintaining perfect grades. One application particularly caught his attention, a girl named Lisa Thompson, whose father had died in an electrical accident when she was 15. She'd been working part-time at a hardware store ever since, learning about tools and construction materials while maintaining a 4.0 grade average. Her essay talked about wanting to study electrical engineering to prevent the kind of accidents that had taken her father. "Dad, read this," Brandon said, handing me her application. "She reminds me of you at that age, determined, practical, not afraid of hard work." I read through Lisa's story, noting the parallels to my own youth. "What strikes you most about her application?" "She's not looking for a handout. She's asking for an opportunity to build something meaningful. She wants to honor her father's memory by making sure other families don't go through what hers did." Brandon set down the application and looked at me seriously. "I want to do more than just mentor these kids, Dad. I want to establish a separate fund specifically for children who've lost parents in construction accidents. We could call it the Sarah Russell Memorial Fund." The suggestion caught me off guard. "Using your mother's name?" She would have loved these kids. She would have seen their potential the way she always saw mine, even when I couldn't see it myself. And maybe it would help me feel like I'm carrying on her legacy in a way that actually matters. There was something different in his voice, a quiet conviction that hadn't been there before. This wasn't the old Brandon trying to impress someone or gain approval. This was a man who'd found his purpose. "We'd need to be careful about the legal structure, make sure it's properly managed," I said. "I've been thinking about that. What if I went back to school? Not for marketing this time, but for nonprofit management or social work. I could use my business background to help run the foundation professionally." I studied my son's face, looking for any trace of the entitled young man who'd sent me that bill 6 months ago. All I saw was determination and genuine desire to serve something larger than himself. That would mean starting over again, more debt, more years of school, probably lower income than construction supervision. I know. But some things are more important than money, aren't they? You taught me that, even when I wasn't ready to listen. "These kids understand something I forgot," Brandon said one evening. "That strength comes from honoring where you come from, not running away from it." As we sat there surrounded by scholarship files, I thought about the journey that had brought us here. The real victory wasn't exposing Madison's fraud or saving Brandon from disaster. It was this simple moment. My son choosing to be here, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to be. But the healing hadn't happened overnight. Those first months after the wedding disaster had tested both of us in ways I hadn't expected. Brandon's humiliation had been public and thorough. The story of the runaway bride and the canceled wedding had spread through social media like wildfire, turning him into a cautionary tale about trusting the wrong person. I'd watched him struggle with the shame of it all. Former colleagues who used to invite him to expensive networking events suddenly became too busy to return his calls. Madison's wealthy friends, the same people he'd tried so hard to impress, disappeared from his life as quickly as they'd entered it. The marketing firm where he'd worked let him go just 2 weeks after the wedding fiasco, citing performance issues that we both knew were really about the company distancing itself from his very public embarrassment. "I keep thinking about what you said," Brandon had confided to me one particularly difficult evening about 2 months after everything fell apart. "About how I chose Madison's approval over your feelings. The thing is, I didn't just lose her approval when everything went wrong. I lost everyone's approval. All those people I thought were my friends, my professional network, the whole life I'd built. It was all conditional." "And how does that make you feel?" I'd asked, genuinely curious about his perspective. "Angry at first, then I was embarrassed. But now?" He'd paused, considering his words carefully. "Now I think I'm grateful, because I finally understand what you meant about the difference between relationships built on transactions versus relationships built on something real." It was around that time that Brandon had started spending more time with Stephen's construction crew. At first, I'd worried it was just desperation, a man taking any job he could find to pay his bills. But as the weeks passed, I began to see something different happening. The men Stephen employed were mostly my age or older, guys who'd worked construction their entire lives. They were the kind of people Madison and her friends would have looked right through at a party, considering them invisible servants whose job was to build the backgrounds for more important people's lives. But these men had something that Brandon's former social circle had lacked. They showed up for each other. When Miguel Fernandez's truck broke down and he couldn't afford repairs, the crew took up a collection without being asked. When old Pete Sullivan had a heart attack on the job site, they didn't just visit him in the hospital. They organized a rotation to help his wife with household repairs and grocery shopping until he recovered. When Brandon mentioned struggling to afford work boots on his reduced income, 3 different guys showed up the next day with spare pairs in his size. "These guys have been through real hardship," Brandon had told me one evening, his hands dirty from a day spent installing drywall. "They know what it means to have your back against the wall, to wonder how you're going to pay rent or keep food on the table. But instead of becoming bitter or competitive, they just look out for each other. It's like they understand that we're all in this together." I nodded, remembering my own early days in construction, the way the older workers had taken me under their wing when I was just a kid trying to support a young family. "That's what real community looks like, son. It's not about impressing people or climbing social ladders. It's about being useful to each other." The scholarship fund had grown beyond our original vision. Word had spread through construction circles about the Austin Russell Memorial Scholarship, named after my father, not me, at Brandon's insistence, and donations had started trickling in from unexpected sources. Former colleagues who'd heard about what happened to Brandon, local business owners who'd used our services over the years, even some of the families who'd benefited from past scholarships, sending small amounts with notes about how the program had changed their lives. "Dad, look at this," Brandon had said one evening, showing me a letter from Maria Santos, one of our first scholarship recipients. She'd graduated from community college with honors and was now working as a licensed electrician, the first woman in her family to complete a trade certification. She says she's starting her own electrical contracting business and wants to hire other scholarship recipients as they graduate. She's calling it Santos and Associates, Building Tomorrow's Leaders. The ripple effect had been remarkable. Lisa Thompson, the girl whose father had died in an electrical accident, was now in her second year of engineering school and working part-time as a safety consultant for construction companies. Marcus Wilson had expanded his family's restaurant and started offering free meals to construction workers during their lunch breaks, saying it was his way of giving back to the community that had supported his education. But perhaps the most significant change had been in Brandon himself. The young man who'd once been embarrassed by my work clothes and calloused hands now wore his own construction gear with pride. He'd started attending safety meetings, contributing ideas about how to prevent the kinds of accidents that created the scholarship recipients we served. His supervisor at Stephen's company had mentioned to me privately that Brandon had become one of their most reliable workers, someone who stayed late to help teammates finish difficult projects and never complained about taking on extra responsibilities. "You know what's funny?" Brandon had said to me just last week as we reviewed applications for the next round of scholarships. I spent years thinking that success meant getting as far away from this world as possible. I thought construction work was something you did when you couldn't do anything better. But these people, they're not just building houses and offices. They're building communities. They're creating the infrastructure that lets other people chase their dreams. He'd held up an application from a 17-year-old named David Anderson, whose single mother worked 3 jobs to support the family. The boy wanted to study civil engineering so he could design better low-income housing, inspired by watching his mother struggle to find safe, affordable places to live. "This kid gets it," Brandon had continued. "He understands that you don't have to choose between helping people and being successful. You can build a career around making things better for others." Tommy had become an important part of our routine as well. My sister's son was dealing with his parents' divorce by throwing himself into learning everything he could about tools and building. Brandon had proven to be a patient teacher, remembering what it felt like to be a confused kid trying to make sense of adult problems. "Uncle Brandon," Tommy had asked one afternoon while we worked on replacing the back deck, "why did Madison leave Brandon at the wedding? Didn't she love him?" Brandon had set down his hammer and looked at the boy seriously. "I thought she did, Tommy, but I learned something important. Some people don't know how to love other people. They only know how to use them." "How can you tell the difference?" "Well," Brandon had said, glancing at me with a small smile, "people who really love you stick around when things get hard. They help you become better instead of trying to change you into something you're not, and they never make you choose between them and your family." "Is that why Grandpa Austin helped you even when you were mean to him?" The question had caught us both off guard. Brandon had been quiet for a long moment before answering. "Yes, I think it is. Grandpa Austin knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable someone's bad behavior, even when it hurts everyone involved." "Tomorrow we start the scholarship interviews," Brandon said, bringing me back to the present moment. "Ready to change some lives? With you, I'm ready for anything." The invoice he'd sent me 6 months earlier was still in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as proof that sometimes the most expensive lessons are worth every penny you refuse to pay. If you enjoyed this story of family, forgiveness, and the courage to set boundaries, even with those we love most, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complex dynamics of human relationships. Share your thoughts about my journey in the comments below. Have you ever had to choose between enabling someone you love and helping them learn difficult truths? For another compelling story about family loyalty and moral courage, click on the video to the left. Thank you for listening. And remember that sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to make someone else's problems your own.